Well, thank you all very much for coming out to hear this. And thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction, and to Sheffield Cathedral for hosting this. It's really a privilege for me to get to share this work with you. As Bob mentioned, this topic is something that I am currently working on. It's a book project that I'm working on this year, about 2/3 of the way through the writing right now. Through first drafts, I should say, of the writing, and hoping to finish a complete draft sometime in the summer. So you may see this book available sometime next year or the year after that is most likely. So what I want to do is I want to kind of walk through some of what I've worked through on the book so far, hitting some highlights. And I'll start with this basic question, which is really where I start in the book. When I'm deciding what to do, is it best for me to treat my own interests as more important than others' interests as more important than my own, or my own and others' interests as equally important? For our purposes, I think it's helpful to think about the notion of importance here in terms of the giving of reasons. And so we might rephrase the question in the following way. When I'm deciding what to do, is it best for me to treat my own interests as providing more reason for action than is provided by others' interests? Or should I instead treat others' interests as providing more reason for action than is provided by my own interests? Or should I treat my own and others' interests as providing equally strong reason for action? Now, I start with this basic question, and what I'm up to in the book is this. I want to draw on some ideas in the New Testament and to provide an answer to this question. And the way that I'll do that is by identifying a character trait that I think is in view in the New Testament, where this character trait involves putting others first in the process of deciding what you should do. So here's an outline of what I'm going to try to talk through in our time tonight. I'll start by saying a bit about this character trait of other-centeredness, providing a kind of working definition of the trait. I'll then say a bit about why I think that certain texts in the New Testament are reasonably understood to be advocating on behalf of possessing this trait of other-centeredness, that they are instructing readers to cultivate and to act in accordance with other-centeredness. And I'll then say a little bit about why it's better to be other-centered than to not be other-centered. And if we have enough time, I'll end by saying a bit about potential dangers of other-centeredness. I'll be here thinking about how to respond to some worries about being other-centered. Is everybody following me okay so far? Okay, great. So we'll start with the character trait of other-centeredness. And here's a working definition. We'll think of other-centeredness as a tendency to treat the interests of each other person as more important than one's own interests for purposes of deciding what to do, just because they're someone else's rather than yours. To illuminate this idea, here are a couple of quotations from the part of the book where I talk about the basic nature of other-centeredness. I say that this treatment of others' interests as more important than one's own involves assigning greater weight to others' interests just because they're others, assigning greater weight to them than you assign to your own. Another comment that might help us understand this: the fact that an interest is another's interest rather than one's own interest gives it a boost for the other-centered person in terms of the contribution that it makes to the person's overall moral deliberation, to their overall trying to figure out what to do. This illustration might help a little bit. Suppose you know that a potential act of yours will promote someone's interest, but you don't know whose. You then learn that the interest that you will promote is someone else's rather than yours. For the other-centered person, this would provide them with greater reason for performing the act in question. And we might contrast that person, the other-centered person, with a person that we might call self-centered or with a person that we might call neutral. For the self-centered person, if they learn that an interest is an interest of someone else's rather than their own, they will think that they then have less reason for promoting that interest than they otherwise would have thought. For a neutral person, if they come to find out that this interest is someone else's rather than their own, it'll make no difference. They'll think they have just as much reason to promote it as if they had found out that the interest was their interest rather than someone else's. Okay. Now, as I'm working through this, talking through this, I'm thinking perhaps I should say a little bit about the notion of interest, because I've said that word a lot. I won't say a lot about it. What I have in mind when I talk about someone's interest here is just what is good for them, so getting what is good for them or avoiding what is bad for them. And of course, the next question will be, well, what is it that's good for a person, or what is it that persons need to avoid? What is it that's bad for someone? For the most part, I hope that my work in this book actually doesn't require me to take a controversial stand on how to understand those things. So I'll let you kind of think in your own way about what it is good, what is good for a person, and what is bad for a person, what a person needs to avoid in order to live well. I'll let you fill in the details of that how you like, and it shouldn't make a difference for my purposes. Okay, so there's a working definition of other-centeredness, and you can see how, given this definition, a person who possesses this trait would be appropriately described as someone who's putting others first. Maybe there's other ways to put others first too, but here's one way of putting others first: to treat their interests as more important than one's own for purposes of deciding what to do. So I'll move now to other-centeredness in the New Testament. In a way, I've been thinking about the topic of other-centeredness for several years now, tracing back to a paper that I published in, I want to say 2014, that was probably written a year or two before that. The way that I came to think about this trait was through thinking about a certain passage in the New Testament that I'm going to say a bit about here in a moment. What I was doing at the time was I was thinking about contemporary philosophical work on the topic of humility. And what I noticed was that accounts of the nature of humility as a character trait, current accounts of the nature of humility as a character trait, didn't seem to capture what was in view in a particular passage in the New Testament that talks about humility. And so I wrote a bit about how this notion of humility in this passage might be understood. And my work there was moving me in the direction of thinking about other-centeredness. Now, I think there's something valuable about pointing that out. So pointing out that this thinking about other-centeredness for me originated by looking at some texts in the New Testament. What's one thing that's important about it is that if I'm right that these texts are plausibly understood as advocating for other-centeredness, and if I'm also right that there's something uniquely valuable about being other-centered, then this project as a whole will kind of illustrate a truth that I think is important for philosophers and psychologists working on character today to recognize. And that truth is this, that it's worth our time to carefully attend to foundational religious texts in an effort to think about whether they might provide potential sources of distinctive insights into what it is to live well. So that's why I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. I'm also spending a little bit of time on it in this context because I thought it might be of some interest to the audience. So I'll start with this passage. There are a few places that I think a case can be made for thinking that a text in the New Testament advocates on behalf of other-centeredness. But the one where I think the case can be made most powerfully is this text. And this comes from the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verse 3. And the New American Standard Version translates it this way: "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves." Now, this translation is representative. It's representative in that if you go and look at alternative translations, you will find very, very similar overlap in the way that they treat this passage. And it's particularly the latter half of it that I'm focusing on, so everything from the word "but" onward. Usually it will have a contrast word like "but," and then it will cite either humility of mind or humility or lowliness, and then it will give instructions about regarding or considering each other or one another to be more important or to surpass or to be more excellent or to value one another more than you value yourself, is usually how this is treated. Now, reading this text as a philosopher, it leads you to wonder. It leads you to puzzle a bit. As I put it, the text raises an interpretive challenge. Now, it's an interpretive challenge that as I've been looking through contemporary commentaries on Philippians, is not recognized explicitly, or it's not pointed out explicitly. But notably, it was explicitly recognized by the great medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on Philippians. He talks about it directly. And this is a tentative suggestion on my part as someone who's not a biblical scholar by training. I think that there's a case to be made that the puzzle, the interpretive challenge in view, may have motivated an early textual alteration, so an early alteration to the original text of the letter. There's in some early manuscripts, there's an alteration that's usually thought to be a patently secondary reading, and my suggestion is that the reason the alteration was made, or at least a reason it was made, was to address the interpretive challenge that I'm going to talk about here in a second. The interpretive challenge is this: is there a plausible interpretation of this text where it doesn't involve the author in encouraging a certain kind of collective incoherence? And I'll say what I mean by this incoherence here. So here's just a quotation from the chapter in the book about this. The author appears to be encouraging each and every reader to adopt a positive orientation toward the idea that every other reader is greater than or better than or superior to herself. Yet, if each and every reader adopts a positive orientation toward that idea, then it seems that of necessity, at least some of the readers will thereby adopt a positive orientation toward an idea that is wrong. For it simply cannot be the case, it would seem, that for each reader, every other reader really is better than or greater than or superior to her. You might think about it, might compare it to the case of a mathematical comparative relation. So in the passage, there seems to be some kind of comparative idea speaking about the relationship between others and the self, greater than or superior to, this kind of comparing relation. If you think about mathematics, there's comparative relations used there too, such as the notion of mathematically greater than. It would seem puzzling to us, it would seem impossible to us to think that, well, if 4 is greater than 2, then 2 is also greater than 4. It's like, no, that can't be. That same kind of worry arises here. How could it be that each and every reader really is greater than each and every other reader? That's the basic puzzle. So the challenge then is to try to interpret the passage in a plausible way, in a way that is faithful to the original author, where the author isn't encouraging that, where the author isn't requiring that if his readers do what he's telling them to, that they'll end up, at least some of them, being positively oriented toward an idea that's wrong. Now, I mentioned that Aquinas notices this puzzle and talks about it a bit, and he has a strategy to try to get out of it. His strategy was to particularize the features of others that are to be regarded as superior to one's own. So his thought was that it's not that each and every reader ought to treat each and every other reader as superior to himself in every respect. Rather, you treat each and every other reader as superior to you in certain particular respects in which they really are superior to you, was basically his thought. That's a way of trying to get around this puzzle, right? It's a way of trying to interpret the text. Perhaps it's faithful to the author, and it gets around the puzzle that I was mentioning. If you read it in Aquinas' way, it's not encouraging collective incoherence. A different way, one that I alluded to a moment ago, is provided by the textual alteration that I mentioned. So in some early manuscripts, there's an insertion of the Greek word tous, which ends up particularizing the others who are to be regarded as superior. The basic sense that the alteration gives to the passage is this, that it's not that you're to treat each and every other reader as superior to yourself, but rather you are to regard as superior those who really do exceed you, those ones that do. Right? So particularly some others, not all others. Right? Now, both of these strategies, while they do address the puzzle, they are pretty consistently rejected by contemporary commentators. They think that while these approaches to resolving the puzzle might resolve the puzzle, they aren't faithful to the intentions of the author. They aren't plausible as interpretations of the passage. So I think there's a better way to read the passage, and that's to read the passage as encouraging other-centeredness. Whereas Aquinas' strategy particularizes the features of others that are to be regarded as superior to one's own features, and whereas the strategy that's evidenced by the insertion of the word tous particularizes the others who are to be regarded as superior, reading the passage as encouraging other-centeredness particularizes it in a different way. It particularizes the purpose for which others are to be regarded as superior or more important than yourself. If we read it in this way, the basic sense of the passage is this, that each reader is to regard each other as more important than herself for purposes of deciding what she will do. So you're supposed to treat my interests you're supposed to treat me as more important than you for purposes of deciding what you will do. And I'm supposed to treat you as more important than me for purposes of deciding what I will do. Now, I think that's another way of trying to get out of the puzzle, and it's also a way that's more faithful than these alternative ways. to the original intentions of the author. One of the things that's often pointed out by commentators in responding to these other suggestions is that the whole tenor of the passage is focused. First off, it's not about an orientation toward particular features of others. It's about an orientation toward others. You're supposed to regard others as more important than yourself, not just features. And second off, the whole tenor of this part of the letter is about how each member in the community is supposed to be related to each and every other member in the community so as to achieve a certain kind of unity. So it seems like we shouldn't particularize the others and say it's only some people that you ought to treat as more important than yourself. So reading the passage in this way is more faithful than these alternative ways. But if we read the passage in this way, then that simply is to interpret the passage as encouraging other-centeredness in the way that I defined it earlier. So the way to understand the passage is to understand it as is encouraging each reader to treat the interests of each other reader as more important than his own interests for purposes of deciding what he'll do, which is how I was defining other-centeredness. Now, that's a kind of argument for interpreting this text as encouraging other-centeredness. Interpret it this way because doing so is a plausible interpretation of the text that solves this puzzle about the text. But there's other reason for interpreting the text in this way too, and that other reason can be found in the fact that contemporary commentators tend to confirm this interpretation of the text as well. So here are a few quotations that confirm this interpretation, quotations from contemporary commentators working on the text. A commentator named O'Brien says that the term tapaina phrasune, translated humility of mind in the passage, denotes other person-centeredness. The passage is, he says, an admonition to focus one's attention on the interests of others. Gordon Fee, in his commentary, says, we are so to consider others in our caring for them, in our putting them and their needs ahead of our own. It is not so much that others in the community are to be thought of as better than I am, but as those whose needs and concerns surpass my own. Ruman says that others, not we, have priority. That person's, that is the other person's, well-being provides the norm for community relationships. And Park, in a book-length work on the topic of submission in the book of Philippians, says this: the chief aspect in this submission that she detects in Philippians and thinks is in view in this passage is the primacy of others over and above and possibly at the risk of the self. Submission in Philippians is depicted primarily as selflessness. Just want to check, how am I on time?
Well, that's it. So you've done about 24 minutes.
Okay. So I'll be a bit briefer here. I do think that other-centeredness is encouraged elsewhere in the New Testament as well. And I think that the case for thinking that it's encouraged elsewhere in the New Testament is strengthened if you already grant that it's being encouraged in Philippians. A few other places where you might find other-centeredness encouraged in the New Testament. One place to look is elsewhere in Paul's writings. So Karl Barth, in his commentary on Philippians, says that the passage that we're talking about here in a couple of verses surrounding it represents the heart of the Pauline ethic. And so if he's right about that, you would expect these ideas to be reflected elsewhere in his writings, and indeed these ideas are reflected elsewhere in his writings. So in particular, there are direct textual parallels in these passages listed here, 1 Corinthians 10:24 and Romans 12:10. Another place you can look is in the synoptic teaching about discipleship, especially in the unit of Mark 8:31 through 10:45. Here in this unit, 3 times Jesus predicts he's going to die and then provides some teaching to his disciples about the nature of greatness in the kingdom of God. And this is where you get memorable sayings of Jesus like, whoever wants to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven must be the servant of all, right? And whoever wishes to follow me must take up you must take up your cross and follow me. The kind of denial of self-idea that you often get in Jesus' teaching recurs throughout this text. And then lastly, some authors have noticed that there are some really interesting parallels between the narrative of the foot washing in John 13 and the description of Christ in the so-called Christ hymn that follows immediately in the book of Philippians on the heels of the passage we were looking at. One author, Hawthorne, has suggested that the Christ hymn in Philippians was perhaps even modeled on a kind of reflection on the foot washing event that's told about in John. And he says this about the foot washing event, that it's an acted parable to summarize the essence of Jesus' teaching. Whoever wants to be great among you must be everybody's slave. I think that you could read these sections of Scripture as also encouraging other-centeredness. All right, so enough about finding other-centeredness in the New Testament. Another part of my project is to try to think about, well, okay, is this trait, what reasons are there for thinking that it's better to be other-centered than to not be other-centered? And what I try to do in this section of the book, well, what I begin by doing, I should say, is making a provisional case with widespread appeal for thinking that being other-centered is better than not being other-centered. And when I say a case with widespread appeal, what I'm trying to do is to provide, what I end up doing is providing three distinct arguments for thinking that being other-centered is better than not being other-centered. And the arguments should have an appeal to people with different ethical commitments. So I'm drawing on three different kinds of ethical theory and trying to show that these three different kinds of ethical theory all end up motivating being other-centered. I'll talk about two of those three arguments here tonight. Now, the case that at least as I begin stating it, is a provisional case. Provisional in the sense that my focus is on goods or admirable behaviors to which being other-centered gives rise. I set aside for the moment the question of whether other-centeredness might also give rise to bads or to contemptible behaviors, something I'll return to, but something that for the moment I'll set aside. I'm going to focus and think about for a bit whether other-centeredness gives rise to certain goods or certain admirable behaviors, and make a provisional case for thinking that it's better to be other-centered than not on that basis. So I said I'll talk about two of the ways I try to argue in favor of other-centeredness. The first is what I call the exemplarist case. It's a case that appeals to an ethical view called exemplarism. And exemplarism has recently attracted a lot of attention, in large part because of the woman who's pictured there, Linda Zagzebski, a philosopher at the University of Oklahoma, who has just completed a book, I believe it's called Exemplarist Moral Theory, defending exemplarism as an ethical position. I think that you can draw on exemplarism to try to provide an argument for thinking that it's better to be other-centered than not. If you're attracted to exemplarism, then you ought to be attracted to the idea that other-centeredness is valuable. So here's how the argument goes. Given exemplarism, if exemplarism is true, then if other-centeredness plausibly explains behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny, then other-centeredness is a virtue. But other-centeredness does plausibly explain behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny, so given exemplarism, other-centeredness is a virtue. To say a little bit about the first two claims there, The first one is just about how exemplarism is defined. So what's key to exemplarism is the idea that our emotion of admiration tracks value. It's not that we're infallible, that every time we admire someone or admire something that someone's done, we get it right. Sometimes we get it wrong. But the thought is that admiration is a fallible but trustworthy guide to identifying value in the world. And that when we think critically, carefully, together for a long time about objects of admiration, this can help us to figure out what good character traits are. So in particular, if we undergo this process of critical scrutiny, thinking carefully together for a long period of time about behaviors, and we continue to admire those behaviors, then exemplarism will tell us that traits that explain those behaviors are virtues, okay? Or provide us with reason for thinking that. Now, the second claim here is that other-centeredness plausibly does explain behaviors for which our admiration survives critical scrutiny. That there are behaviors that people engage in that we admire, and that upon reflection for extended periods of time together, thinking as hard as we can about whether we really ought to be admiring these folks, we continue admiring them. Some examples. One batch of examples can actually be identified in the book of Philippians. So something interesting about the way that the book of Philippians is set up is that a lot of authors will think that the unit that we were looking at, that I was saying encourages other-centeredness, is a kind of hinge to the whole text, and that elsewhere in the text is just littered with examples of people that are thought of by the author as exemplifying other-centeredness. So Timothy, Epaphroditus, Paul more than once, Jesus in the Christ hymn that I was speaking about a moment ago. These are all exemplars of the trait of other-centeredness, if that really is the trait that's in view in the text we're looking at. And some of those exemplars are among the very best candidates you could think of for people for whom our admiration would survive critical scrutiny, like Jesus. Okay, second example. Rescuers, such as rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. So in their definitive work on what made the difference between people who rescued Jews during the Holocaust and people in similar circumstances who didn't, the O-liners in their book, The Altruistic Personality, say that what made the difference was that the rescuers were committed to what they call values of care rather than values of equity. And if you look at how they define these values, they put it this way. They say, while equity asks that we act out of a sense of self-interest as well as the interests of others, care focuses on the interests of others. Others, rather than self, were the primary focus for rescuers. And I think if you look through their book and look at some of the examples they discuss, you'll find further confirmation of the idea that, in at least many cases, their admirable behaviors were partially explained by their being other-centered. And then lastly, subjects of contemporary exemplarist research. So there's a strain of research in contemporary psychology that looks at exemplary people who have won awards for being especially caring, something like this. And over the course of several decades now, people who have worked on studying these exemplars, a couple of the most robust findings that they've come upon are these. They find, first off, that morally exemplary people are very strongly motivated in general. They're very strongly motivated both to pursue their own interest and to pursue others' interests. But in addition, what makes them different from others is that they tend to instrumentalize their own interests for the sake of others' interests. So they tend to pursue their own interests in order to promote interests of others. So they might, for example, pursue a position with certain entitlements in order to benefit other people. Right? And this is how they consistently narrate their life stories. If you think that interests that are treated as terminal rather than instrumental, right, are treated by the person as more important than the instrumental interests, then this would be a case of people who are treating others' interests as more important than their own. Another example where potentially other-centeredness is explaining admirable behavior for which our admiration will survive critical scrutiny. All right, there's the exemplarist case. Now the consequentialist case. So this draws on a different ethical view, no longer exemplarism, but a different ethical view, consequentialism, and tries to argue that from this perspective, too, there's reason to think that being other-centered is better than not being other-centered. It goes like this. Given consequentialism, if it is more likely that one will promote the greatest overall value by being other-centered than by not being other-centered, then it is better to be other-centered than to not be. But it is more likely that one will promote the greatest overall value by being other-centered than by not being other-centered. So given consequentialism, it's better to be other-centered than not to be. So the first claim here is basically just explaining how consequentialist views bear on what you should think about other-centeredness. Consequentialist views will just tell us that the value of a character trait is determined by its consequences, whether having that character trait leads to the best overall outcomes, right? The second claim is the more controversial one, that being other-centered really does lead to better overall outcomes than not being other-centered. Why think that? Why think that if I'm other-centered, I'll somehow promote a greater overall outcome than if I'm not other-centered? Here is the beginnings of an argument in that direction, which to develop it fully takes a bit of work. But I think the basic idea will still be helpful. Suppose you have to decide between promoting an interest of your own or promoting someone else's interest, where the values of the interests are equal. It's just as good, all things considered, just as good if your interest is promoted as it is if the other person's interest is promoted. They're equally good interests. Now, the other-centered in such a scenario will tend to favor promoting others' interests. They'll do that because they treat others' interests as providing greater reason for action than their own interests. My contention is that promoting the other's interest, promotes greater overall value than promoting your own interest would, because in addition to promoting the interest in question, the particular good for the other person, the other-centered also promote interpersonal union with the other. So the reason I've pictured this person here, this is a philosopher called Robert Adams, and he's been one of several philosophers who have tried to stress this point that when you think about what to do, it's not enough to think about what goods or bads your act will bring about for particular people, yourself included. You have to also think about what relational goods or bads your action brings about. It's not enough to think about how my act promotes goods just for you or goods just for me or prevents bads for you, prevents bad for me. I also have to think about how my act affects relationships between people. Right? Now, if you think that point is true, then I think that we can use it to build a defense of being other-centered. Because, as I was saying, other-centered people will tend to favor promoting others' interests to their own, and when they do that, they not only promote the other person's interests, but they will always also promote some degree of interpersonal union with the other as well. There's a lot more to say about this line of argument to fully defend it. I won't say a lot of it now. I'll say just a little bit. I'll say a little bit about the notion of interpersonal union, because I think that's important for us to begin to grasp the argument. When I talk about interpersonal unions there, I mean unions between persons. And these unions can come, they can be of different kinds. So a union like a friendship, that's one way in which people can be united in relationship. An action that promotes the maintenance or deepening of a friendship, that's one way for it to promote an interpersonal union. But there are many others too. For example, actions can promote cooperation between people. This is another way in which people can be united, is by cooperating with one another in various ways. There's different kinds of cooperation. Another way in which people can be united is that one person can... This idea has emerged in discussion of autism, that some writers, many writers I should say, think that one of the major differences between people with severe autism and people who don't have severe autism is that people with severe autism have trouble identifying the mental states of others, identifying when they're having emotions, and so on. One way in which a person can be united to another is a kind of union with their mental states, a knowing of what they care about and what they value and what they're feeling. That kind of union is required if you're going to go about trying to promote others' interests, but it's not required if you're going to go about promoting your own interests. Those are some examples of different ways in which people can, different kinds of interpersonal unions. So the basic thought is that in cases where you're deciding between promoting someone else's interests versus your own, if we suppose that the interests in question are themselves just as valuable as one another, other-centered people will tend to prefer promoting the other's interests, whereas self-centered people will tend to promote their own, and neutral people, it's kind of a toss-up. But in doing this, other-centered people will promote greater overall value than those to whom we're comparing them, because in promoting others' interests, they won't just promote the interest of the other, they'll also promote these interpersonal unions, which will not necessarily be promoted when a person chooses to promote his own interests instead. All right. How am I? Yeah? Okay. I'll talk a little bit briefly about potential dangers of other-centeredness. So remember that case that I was sketching is intended to be a provisional case. A provisional case on behalf of thinking that being other-centered is better than not being other-centered. Provisional in large part because my focus there is on goods to which other-centeredness is conducive and admirable behaviors to which it's conducive. And I was setting aside for the moment whether other-centeredness might also be a font of bads, might lead you to do bad things. If it turned out that being other-centered necessarily also led to the promotion of bads, well, then the case that I've been developing would be neutralized. Okay. So our question then is, does other-centeredness necessarily lead to the promotion of bads as well as goods like interpersonal union? Here are a couple of ways that you might take this objection. One kind of bad that you might think about are bads or dangers of self-harm. So in the mid-20th century, there was a very effective and powerful critique given of a certain strain in Christian theology about love, neighbor love, as it was called. There were some authors who are often referred to as the Agabus because they were thinking about agape, the New Testament word for love. And they were heavily criticized by some feminist theologians in the middle of the 20th century who were resistant to some of their ideas about the self-sacrificial nature of love. And you might think that a similar kind of criticism could be developed against other-centeredness. The worry was basically, what was along these lines? It was a worry about, look, you guys are going around encouraging everyone to be self-sacrificial, but some of us are self-sacrificial by nature, and to encourage us to be even more self-sacrificial, we're just going to end up destroying ourselves. In particular, there was a concern that this was the plight of many women. So here's a quotation that's cited in this literature sometimes. I really did devote my life to Thurmond in every respect, and all of a sudden, I have to make a life of my own, and I don't know where to start. You put yourself last all the time, and all of a sudden, the person that you banked on is gone. So the kind of worry generated by this is that, well, look, if a person systematically through the course of her life puts others first, puts herself last, she may neglect her self-maintenance, even to a point where other-centeredness might become self-undermining, that because you've put others before yourself so much, you can no longer tend to the needs of others because you've crushed your own abilities. There's a worry about self-harm. Another kind of worry, you might worry that the other-centered are necessarily going to end up only giving help that hurts. There's been, the person pictured here is a psychologist called Airy Nadler, and he has kind of pioneered a recent turn of interest in psychological research on help that focuses attention not on the helpers, where it had been focused for decades, but on the recipients of help, how help actually impacts people. He says this: the implicit assumption that has governed much of past research, which is that help is uniformly good and more help is even better, is false. That assumption is articulated from the helper's perspective rather than from the recipient's perspective. He goes on to say this about how it is that giving help that really helps is a tricky thing. It says, under certain conditions, the feeling of belongingness, which he thinks is among human beings' fundamental desires, a feeling of belongingness dominates, and people in need are receptive to help, grateful for it, and feel good about themselves and their relationship with the benefactor. But under different conditions, the inconsistency between dependency on the assistance of others and the person's need for independence is salient. So he thinks there are two fundamental needs that may play a role in determining how a person will respond to help. One is belongingness, the other is independence. Sometimes the need for independence is the salient need. When this is the case, people in need will refrain from seeking help, experience a threat to their self-esteem when receiving it, and fail to feel or express gratitude toward their benefactor. These feelings may poison their relationship with the helper. Okay. So the worry that this generates for other-centeredness is this. The way that I defined other-centeredness, the other-centered person treats the interests of others as more important than her own just because they're others, without regard to further particular facts about the other. The bare fact that it's someone else's interest, that alone provides the person with greater reason to try to promote it than if it were her own reason. So it's not other-centeredness is not defined in such a way that the other-centered person is by definition attending to particular features of others. But it sure seems like this research shows that whether help ends up helping or hurting depends upon particular features of the other. So you might worry that being other-centered is going to end up leading you to just give help that hurts. Or at least to not consistently give help that helps. All right. So what about those potential dangers? Is other-centeredness really a font of those bads? Does it really lead people to harm themselves in this way and to hurt others in this way? I think it doesn't. So I think, but nonetheless, I think that the objections teach us something very important about other-centeredness. So I think the objections are misguided. The basic reason for this is that while other-centeredness does require treating others' interests as providing greater reason for action than is provided by comparable interests of the self, other-centeredness doesn't preclude also attending to the reasons for action highlighted by these objections. So part of the way these objections work is they highlight certain reasons for action. So, for example, the worry about help that hurts, it highlights the fact that particular features of a person that you might be helping make a difference for whether your potential help ends up helping or hurting. And that provides a reason for you to change how you might act. Other-centeredness doesn't, and my basic point is just this. Other-centeredness doesn't require overlooking those facts, right? It, by definition, requires attending to certain facts. It requires that the other-centered person treats others' interests as more important than his own just because they're others. But that doesn't necessarily have to stop the other-centered person from thinking that, oh, I better not promote this person's interest because of particular features this person has. Okay? So my view is that other-centeredness doesn't require that the other-centered person overlooks or neglects the reasons that are highlighted by these objections, though it doesn't require that a person attend to them by definition. So I don't think the objections succeed in showing that a robust case can't be made for thinking that it's better to be other-centered than not. But I do think that they teach us something important. They teach us that there are certain dangers to which other-centered persons are prone if their other-centeredness is not accompanied by other valuable character features and a cooperative environment. So, if an other-centered person is insensitive to particular features of others that make them different and might have a role to play in how they would receive help, for example, then her being other-centered might be a danger, right? But that's not because she's other-centered. It's because she lacks a sensitivity to, she lacks another valuable trait. She lacks a sensitivity to particular features of others that play a role in how they receive help. Okay? In that respect, other-centeredness is not different from other character traits. So you might think the same kind of thing is true for gratitude or bravery or anything else. I was thinking of generosity or bravery or anything else. The generous person has a tendency to try to benefit others with his resources. But if he's inattentive, insensitive to particular features of others that have a role to play and what promotes what they're good and so on, then his generosity might lead to bads. In the same kind of way that we're thinking, we were worried here that other-centeredness might lead to bads. So I don't think that these objections show that we shouldn't think of other-centeredness as a virtue, but they do highlight certain dangers to which other-centered people may be prone if they don't have other valuable character traits and if the world doesn't cooperate with them. Okay. All right, I'll stop there.